Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. You may have heard the expressions, everybody's normal until you get to know them, and it takes all kinds, with their implied messages of inclusion and the acceptance of differences. For people with autism, that inclusion may take an extra effort on the part of society, and unfortunately, that support is often not there. In this episode of Human Rights Magazine, Emma Nahmiach looks into the situation in Canada and the shortcomings of its public health system in responding to autism. She spoke with several experts, including a young graduate student who's nonverbal. Using a text-to-speech process, he typed his comments, which were then produced as spoken words. Emma's guests agree that more needs to be done, starting with early diagnosis to ensure that people with autism get support in their neurodiversity.
Autism spectrum disorder is typically defined as a genetic neurodevelopmental condition causing differences in individuals displaying skills or processing of sensory, social, emotional, or behavioral traits. Those who have autism experience it each uniquely on a wide variety, although there are recurring indications that do exist. Canada is especially relevant to speaking about autism within its population, as 1 in 60 Canadians is diagnosed every year as of 2019, and even then, these numbers are thought to be underrepresented. Experiencing neurodiversity and developmental differences in a neurotypical world, the idea would be that those diagnosed can be accommodated and supported by society since young. But in reality, Canada severely lacks in outreach for those individuals and their families. Much of the therapy offered surrounds a negative, remedial view of the condition and autistic individuals' place in society, and those professionals and services that do exist anyways are small in numbers and massively underfunded. If autism is not a rarity, why do public and governmental programs overlook them as so? Here to speak today are 4 speakers, Deborah Pugh, Estee Clark and her son Adam Wolfund, and Bruce Petherick, who are all advocates and participants in the community, experiencing autism themselves or having autistic people in their families. First, I spoke to Deborah Pugh on her opinion of the situation concerning lack of support for autistic people and their families, both in her current province, British Columbia, and in Canada broadly. She also expanded on how the consequences of this lack of support manifests. Deborah Pugh was the executive director at ACT, Autism Community Training, in British Columbia since 2005. She was previously a journalist and correspondent in Cairo, but having a son with autism, she returned home to Canada to raise him and became passionate on the issue and a participant in the Community for Change. Holding its first conference in 2003, ACT aims to provide training and information within communities and those in contact with autistic children to provide better support in their everyday lives and future. They do this through live events, conferences, and free online videos.
Well, it's because autism is in and of itself a very diverse diagnosis, and because diagnosis is so hard to have or so hard to get in terms of the waiting lists and the cost, because often it's privately diagnosed because there's not enough doctors who are trained to diagnose it. Because of that, the situation is actually very difficult. It's very difficult in British Columbia with a waiting list well over 2 years for children. And it's difficult even to find publicly funded diagnosticians for adults at all. So it's a fairly dire situation right now, and the situation certainly has gotten much worse through COVID. Across the country, it's a very similar situation. There's no province in Canada that really is providing any leadership anymore about how to achieve early diagnosis and ongoing support. So I guess one of the things to think of in terms of the reality of autism is it's an invisible disability. And with the right fit of supports for individual to that child or adult, the person can do really well. Finding out what that good fit is not that easy. And so when there's hardly any funding available, or children have been left to wait for years for a diagnosis, or in the case of adults, people are misdiagnosing them with all kinds of things. That makes the situation much worse. So a person who doesn't get a diagnosis, who doesn't get the supports they need, doesn't just remain as they are. They often deteriorate because of the pressures of the, social pressures, financial pressures, a family who doesn't understand that this child isn't just naughty, isn't stupid, but is dealing with a very complex condition, invisible condition. All of those things make it really challenging for families, for autistic adults, for schools. It's like, we're all moving through a very uncertain world where there's lots of opinions, and not that many resources to support the individuals.
I think what you noted about diagnosis being a revelation is really important, not because a diagnosis has to define an individual's entire life, but it can help them understand their struggles or their thought process, and for younger children, it can help their parent understand the way they see the world. I know that diagnosis and lack of funding are one of the biggest problems right now, but because of the growing issue, why do you think the government has reluctance to help more? Is it truly that we don't have enough professionals and they don't know how to implement that?
So diagnosis is a provincial responsibility, right, through the health services. The federal government funds the provinces to provide health services, but it's often it's the provinces who set their priorities, and it's very difficult to. I've been trying this. I've been working on this in British Columbia for about a decade now, and I'm about to retire. And I can tell you, I think it's right up there and one of my biggest failures. I've had many failures, Emma, but this is right up there. And it's trying to convince the health authority to, at the Vancouver Coastal Health level, because of course provinces also divide and give each region responsibility for how they implement. So we've been trying to do this at the level of Vancouver Coastal Health. And we were getting, we'd had a survey of doctors, and the health authority had come up with some strategies, and we were getting really close. And then COVID happened, and since then it's been impossible to get anyone to move it from discussion to implementation. But one of the issues is that it takes a lot of time to diagnose and to set up supports for an autistic adult who's saying, now I'm not talking about, usually a child who shows significant signs of autism, both behaviorally and in terms of communication, is usually picked up as a child, right? It's the more able autistics who in their teen and adult years start showing mental health problems, high anxiety, depression, aren't doing as well as they could academically, even though they have a high IQ, they're bombing out at school. These are the people who take time to diagnose, right? And most doctors now, the way things are set up, you have a phone call, or even before COVID, doctors were reluctant to engage in diagnosis of autism because it takes a while, and then you have to help the person set up supports, right? It's an ongoing process. Maybe they do need medication, because sometimes medication can help, right? But not in and of itself. It's really best in combination with other interventions. But the excuse we often hear from physicians is that they don't have the training, but there's very little economic incentive for them to get the training, because you don't get any more money for seeing this patient who might take you 10 times as much time to help as your average patient who comes in with a bit of anxiety or something like that. So there's a financial imperative. We also, of course, have a nationwide shortage of doctors and specialists. And that's been the result of trying to save money by controlling access to medical school. I'm sure lots of very able young people who would be fantastic doctors or psychologists, medical doctors, psychiatrists, or psychologists, or speech language pathologists, or occupational therapists, but they can't get into schools here, even though they've got straight A's, right? There isn't enough spots to train them. So to me, that's the huge, one of the reasons I set up ACT Autism Community Training, I don't know, back in 2003, was because I could see that there were a lot of professionals who had, broad training, but they didn't have any specialized understanding of autism. Right. And it is different. It's not the same as typical people who have anxiety or whatever. It's different. So I guess it is a pervasive problem. It's one that's not going to, I don't think the solution is importing specialists from other parts of the world and stripping them of their resources, which I've always found quite objectionable. It is actually investing in all those terrific young people we have to train them in these professions, including advanced teacher training, all of these things. So, it's not rocket science. It's we would save, I think, a great deal of money in the long term if we invested in our, professional development, so that we had specialists who could help kids. Because right now, there's even a waiting list for private diagnoses in British Columbia, months long. So it's just a really awful situation. It's actually the worst situation in terms of diagnostic waiting lists that I have seen in the last 25 years since I've been involved in the autism community. It is the worst situation. And ironically, we have the most potential to help children and adults. We know more, but we actually can't operationalize it because we don't have the essential professionals to support them.
You just touched on it a little bit, but do you have any opinions on what an ideal implementation of policy would look like in terms of steps we're missing?
I think early identification is key, because with a lot of because we know that we can actually change the trajectory for a lot of children with autistic children. But that doesn't mean the trajectory is that, you're going to make these children indistinguishable from their peers. What it means is, you're going to help them understand social communication at a very early age. You're going to make sure that they're actually able to attend to language so that they don't end up with a very limited vocabulary. You're going to focus on helping them learn play skills so they don't feel isolated or alienated. So that's, for the young set, you're going to identify that and have programs that, are also very effective for typical children, because there's all kinds of kids, with ADHD or other forms of, complex developmental delays that will benefit from this type of intervention. It doesn't look like 40 hours a week being drilled, right? That's not what you do with 2-year-olds. And for many children, you'll find that actually has an incredibly profound, this is what the science is telling us, has a profound effect lifelong. There are those kids, autistic children, for whom this, that kind of naturalistic play environment really isn't effective. And that's really, I think, what I have to say to people is that you cannot generalize with autism. You have to look at the kid, do an assessment, try some things out, see what works, what doesn't, and kind of leave your prejudices and, pet theories behind and focus on the child. And not everyone can do everything. Many children are, most children will be very successful with quite a light program, but there are children for whom there has to be some intensity, that they have to have concrete teaching in order to make it, the meaning of language clear to them. That, for those kids, again, it's not, it's not punitive, but it's intense. It's not something that should be unpleasant at any point, but it's intense. And I think what we have now is a situation where we try and, have one, and there's all these vying intervention programs, but the good ones are actually really very similar in their, what they call things is different, but the actual, engagement, teaching engagement to children, encouraging, helping them develop communication and social skills, so that's the key, right? So I think that what we have now across the country is a sort of a ragtag amalgamation of various things. We very few children get help before they're, at least from a publicly funded system, before they're 5, 6 years old, where the best time would be to help them would be more like when they're 2, 3, and we can diagnose autism now, fairly consistently in 18-month-olds, and that's children with autism who are quite profoundly affected. It's, a child who has no cognitive delays and has language but is still autistic is probably not going to be picked up at 18 months, right? So again, there's not a one size fits all. And that's, I think, what we have a problem with in our society. We want to have, the cookie cutter approach to every child. So the child who's very, who has, we can see that they will have a very difficult life unless we provide them with a really enriched environment early on. The taxpayer will save a fortune. The heartbreak to families will be significant. I can remember the days when autism was considered rare in British Columbia and in Canada. There are only 500 children in the province who were diagnosed. I think we have something like 25,000 now. So you can imagine that it's no longer rare, but I remember what it felt like to have a child with a rare condition. And I think I think that the attitude that there are systems out there that are magically going to help these children is pervasive if you don't have a child with developmental disabilities. When you have them, you realize that there's actually very little out there. But from the outside world, from those who don't have an impact, there is this idea that we live in Canada, we have the Canada Health Act, and these children will be helped. Actually, they have no right to service.
During my research, I also met Estee Clar and son Adam Wolfand, who was diagnosed with autism at 18 months. Starting the organization Disassembly, they aim to sustain an experimental and creative space outside of the government system to gather and support each other. Adam is a nonverbal adult, and during my interview with them, Adam spoke through a text-to-speech device. Adam is also notably the first nonverbal student to be receiving a master's from Concordia University and is currently working on his PhD on neurodiversity and artistic in orthography. They first gave me a general overview on their view of the situation in Canada, and also expanded on their view of the idea of being neurodiverse in a neurotypical world.
I think that schools need to invest in understanding people who manage the way I do with supports, so that I could do many things.
Can I expand on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that support in Canada is not support. It's really garnered around this ABA, IBI, intensive behavioral intervention. in Canada, which is, we market it as like the gold standard of autism therapy and services. It has infiltrated literally every aspect of an autistic person's existence, to the point that schools have adopted it and also conceive of autism as disorder and problem. However, autistic people, speaking back, and a lot of people don't know this, that so many people through the last 20 years and even before then, but when the internet came online and the blogs really started gaining momentum in 2003, 2004, we saw so many autistic people coming out and expressing how damaging this therapy is and how anxiety provoking. I mean, whose right is it to convert an autistic person to become normal, right? The whole neurodiversity movement is premised on diversity and difference, and knowing all the differences that are always in our world emerging, and nobody is the same. However, our schools are really geared to westernized typical knowledges. So if you even think about it, you just need to master indigenous knowledges, right? Or disability itself. If you're only dedicating 2 pages in your social studies book to disability, what is it? What are you teaching people? It's really just like a sideline. It's a marginalized concept, right? However, if you integrate these, if we have many different kinds of learning and knowledges within our school system itself, even maybe it isn't a system anymore. I think we're seeing education and even our conceptions of that evolving all over the map, be it from childhood into the universities, right, that are becoming more corporatized. Just education needs to be access for all. So I think when Adam, you're saying support, we talk a lot about the facilitation of facilitation, which means like we're facilitating each other. So I've also learned how through Adam's movement and through a lot of work and study with others, how certain movement differences in people require touch to activate movement, or to keep consistent, like to speak in neurotypical language, if you will, or normalize the language that we speak, which is this standardized English. Adam's very skilled at also creating new language, or languaging, he calls it, which he has in a book. We're having a book launch on November the 10th, so we speak a lot more about new forms. So I think that's what I'm speaking to overall as well, like new forms of knowledges. How do we think about that in the context of support, in the context of care, outside of these therapeutic thinking that is seeking to cure or make as normal as possible or make functional before the right of inclusion. So, a system as it is in this westernized knowledge and system and the way we do things is a system that is hesitant to change. And you're trying to tack on people who have different knowledges and different ways of moving in the world, being, seeing, whatever, and you're trying to tack them into that, and you're calling that integration and inclusion. So as long as we have that, and we don't acknowledge diversity in all of these contexts, we're going to think of disability, autism, as on the outside, needing to fit inside. And that's always going to precipitate cure and remedial therapies, I think. And henceforth, we have the advent of special education, which seemed really great with Maria Montessori. But it was really meant to, also segregate with this same idea that's infiltrated today. We can teach kids to their potential. All of these tropes and these, instead of acknowledging what diversity brings to our world. And so we need to rethink what diversity means and not think about diagnosis as a means to cure remediation, but can people be supported, right? So that's much easier. And once we got out of that system, our lives just went boom. Like it just became so much enriched. Like now Adam's doing a master's degree at Concordia University. The first non-speaking Canadian person to be at university in Canada, because we've been able to kind of circumvent and make these arguments about how Adam has been excluded because of these barriers. These are like hurdles you got to go through.
Reach the people to vary the ways of love and support the ways we think about care outside the system. Should people be locked up for being disabled? No, they should not. They can be very helpful the way my attraction was starting a movement for liberation.
Huge. But I do think that we need to rethink support. Practically speaking, which may be more what you're after, is, like supported communication, that ABA will not teach, is how I've taught Adam to use this device. That's a really simple accommodation that could be made and taught across the board. When people are really, really anxious, what does ABA do? I've seen ABA therapists, despite their proclamations that they're wonderful, forcibly lift kids off the floor, forcibly move them to another location. And it's really hard to watch. And Adam, I think I'm going to let you speak more, but when you were anxious, we just shut that whole thing down, and we sat together a lot and we were quiet together a lot until, you can work beyond that. But if I left that to a neurologist, to a doctor, to anybody else, I'll tell you what happened. They tell me to call the police. Why am I going to call the police on my child? Or why am I going to then he needs to go on a psychotropic medication. Why am I going to put him on that? Like these are our solutions in our culture right now, because we're impatient and we have an attitude that our kids are wrong. And I would challenge anybody who would say that I've never experienced, or Adam has never experienced, some real hard moments that that other people express. We've gone through a lot.
Next, I had the pleasure of speaking with Bruce Petherek from British Columbia, a sound designer and a professional musician who has toured the world. He was diagnosed with autism later in life as an adult. He is currently working with Autism Canada as an advocate on the issue. I first spoke to Bruce about his and Autism Canada's view of the current situation, his experience, and what he feels like could be done.
I can speak on behalf of Autism Canada. I can speak from across the country. They are lacking in general, and they are severely lacking for adults. So although we have some supports, we have some access for newly diagnosed children, it can be better. All across the country they can be better, but at least they are there at some level. Unfortunately, when we get to somebody who is 18, fundamentally they all disappear across the country. And you have people like myself who I was later diagnosed. I'm seen as needing lesser regular support than some other autistic people. And there's fundamentally nothing for me at all. And in fact, people like myself are missing from statistics. No one records the number of late diagnosed adults who don't then go on and need specific governance support. So lack of support, lack of access across the country, and then amazingly large holes in our data collection. Let's also bring in the lack of representation in the BIPOC community in general for autistic support and diagnosis, and of course still there is a gender imbalance.
My own sister was diagnosed very late, around 18. I think it's harder especially because she's a woman, so I can hear what you're saying. What exactly do we mean by better resources, since the variation of autistic individuals and their needs are so diverse?
We need much better access to diagnosis across the country. We need a system that ignores provincial differences when it comes to diagnoses, because we also have problems with certain provinces expect this and other provinces expect that. We need a national strategy when it comes to things like that. But it's all to do with access to diagnosis is super, super important. Once we have that diagnosis, then we're looking for more broad approaches to support. So often support is seen to be focused on those autistics who need what we call higher support need autistics. Maybe those people are non-speaking, maybe those people who have difficult behavior problems, a severe lack of social communication, etc., etc. There are some resources available for those autistics, but we need a broader spectrum. We need those resources available for, let's just say, every autistic is non-speaking at some stage in their life. Every autistic has problems with social communication always. It's an intensity. I use the word intensity a lot. Every autistic has sensory differences, and those sensory differences change in intensity over time, and that time could be in an hour, in a week, or in years. We need supports that recognize that happens. It's always good to be talking from my personal experience because that's where I'm stronger at, but I can generalize a lot of this. So I have hyperacuity, oral hyperacuity, which means that I can hear sounds at a much greater level than a typical average person. In my previous career, I was a professional musician, recording artist, toured the world. That was incredibly useful. The negative side is it's almost now impossible for me to do shopping in regular department stores because there's so much background noise. There is so much. The music is too loud. The cavernous areas, there's echoes, and it's incredibly disorienting. So the only way I can go shopping is to have noise-cancelling headphones on. That is not fair. We always make this invisible, visible disability discussion. If somebody's in a wheelchair, 100% of the world would never put a barrier in a store. They wouldn't put a ladder down the aisle so at a certain height so a person in a wheelchair couldn't get through. Everybody's aware that when they see a visible disability, that there's some supports, differences that are needed. Those of us with invisible disabilities are ignored. So we're looking for things like much more sensory-friendly spaces, and the reality is that may mean, please can we have an hour or two in the shopping centre every week or every 2 weeks where the lights are turned down and music's turned off. In one respect, that's a simple thing to request, but we can then generalize that across the expectation, for instance, in filling out government forms, that we can comprehend a lot of complex information in a very short period of time, where in fact very often that's incredibly difficult. Autism is a lifelong condition, which is often, I think, people forget. We don't recover, we don't get better, and basically none of us want to get better. I am different. I'm different from you. I love the fact that we are different people, because maybe some of my differences are autistic. That's part of me. There's no difference. There's no line where I'm not autistic or I'm Bruce. It's one continuum. So the lack of early interventions, the lack of access to resources and supports affects us all through our lives. With adults, we're assumed that we've learned those skills, and to a greater or lesser extent, we probably have learned some life management skills, how the world works, but it's still so difficult when it comes to people expecting a certain behavior. And it's always good to remember that, again, let's say an adult, average autistic person, they may have learned this is what this means, this is what this means. If somebody's kind of looking this way, this is what it means. For us, it's a cognitive effort to recognize that. So every time we're involved with social communication, there's something in that our brains are working, going, oh, this means this, this means this, this means this. You need to remember this, you need to remember this. Where for a neurotypical person, all that's internalized. It becomes automatic. So it's draining. It's so tiring for the average adult autistic to get through what neurotypical people would think is just an average day. So it's come to things like that. It also comes down to again, I'm going to say, I understand I don't need supports all the time. But when I do need those supports, they don't exist. And that's as bad as them not existing. I mean, not existing at all for anybody. So it's life-changing. It affects us all the time. It affects us at all levels. And then it brings in it does bring our self-esteem down. We often feel we're not worthy because when we need help, no one can give us the help, or if we ask for help, it's laughed at us. Oh, you don't look autistic. You don't need any help. So social awareness, big thing.
Why do you think there isn't being more of an effort to address this, seeing as it's not a rarity? I think anyone who's even a little bit versed in the subject knows that there has been little movement.
The average person's view of autism is so influenced by media representation. And I will be honest, over the last 5 years, that's actually improved a lot than 20 years before. But it still tends to only focus on very specific individuals. And the other problem is too many people has met one autistic person and then generalized. And so often we get the well, you can't be autistic because you're nothing like my sister's child who may be nonverbal and completely has cognitive delay problems, and that's not me, but we actually are both autistic, just we're representing in different ways. So it's the representation. Community awareness is still sadly lacking, and we are in, as you and I are talking about this now, there are 2 reports in my emails about young autistic adults being arrested by the police and injured because they were seen to be acting suspiciously. And I'm not blaming the police in this because they're reacting to a call that's come in. But again, we've got the community members looking and seeing this person acting strangely and never considering that it's an autistic person because it's a regular autistic behavior. So that representation, that community awareness, then drives into the fact that governments only respond to what their constituents want, and the constituents are not asking the question. Now, we are very lucky that just in the last couple of weeks, we've finally got a national strategy perhaps being put to the Senate. Actually, I think it was tabled in the Senate. We have a conference coming up in a couple of weeks. So at least at the federal level, there is a little bit of movement. And I have to say, it's a small step, but at least it's a step forward. I just wish there'd be more autistic voices involved, because again, it's so often other people speaking on our behalf.
As Bruce importantly noted, representation and awareness is a huge part of any movement for change. I was able to ask each speaker on their opinion of how they thought awareness had grown or changed in the last 5 to 10 years, and if it had progressed the situation for individuals with autism in the country at all. Starting with Deborah, Estee and Adam, and finally Bruce.
I'm thinking about that, Emma. I think it's helped a lot in many ways, but I also think that people still don't know what they don't know. And like a little bit of knowledge can sometimes be dangerous because, oh, I know about autism. This means they're a genius. Or I know about autism. This means that they're, behaviorally challenged. Or I know about autism, So if I look back over 25 years, I think that, it's still pretty early here. So I'm challenged trying to think through what that big picture on that, because it's a very good question. I think that the increase in knowledge has been very important, the increase of awareness. But awareness is one thing, and practical supports is another. And, I think at ACT, our focus is on sort of community training in the sense of much more in depth. We're not really all that interested in awareness per se. We're interested in what are the skills that you will need as a parent or as a professional to be actually helpful in a practical sense. And part of that is awareness that, someone, an autistic child, may have a very sensitive sensory system. But rather than just teaching you that, what are some of the things that you could do to mitigate that sensory sensitivity, right? Like, let's talk about the practice. So I think things have improved significantly in terms of awareness. But I think that when it gets right down to the level of the classroom or the family home, far too much is in the hands of, do you have a parent who has access to this type of education, who even knows that their child has autism? Do you have a school where the principal is providing leadership and support for a teacher who has no idea what to do because they're not taught in teacher training the kind of practical in-depth information that they require? So I think it is a better situation. But it's an ongoing struggle to take what we know from research and from specialists and help transform the everyday lives of people.
I think neurodiversity and neurodivergence have caught on in some communities and definitely in academia as a term that, is a more legitimized term. When I started out in critical disability studies, people still didn't really know what neurodiversity was, and they didn't include autism under the rubric of disability, which is interesting. So that would have been in 2008, 2012. So yeah, there's been some change and more awareness about neurodiversity. There's been a lot more neurodivergent writers emerging, which is really great. But also what's happening, as in every movement, and this is really important, whether it be feminism or Black rights, there is still a diversity of opinion within these groups. And I first want people to understand what the neurodiversity movement is and what the history is, but I'm going to hope that the neuro gets taken out of diversity because if it's medicalized tethers that then are pathologized, fits into the pathology paradigm. So I'm wondering how that's going to shift over time. Everything shifts over time. So whatever that politics may be, what is fundamental is that we look at diversity of human species and we really rethink what care and support is.
Yes, I think that I give credit to the autistic people who have helped me gain access to getting an education that knows my way of learning, managed to be the autistic maker of new forms of being and becoming.
I think one of the most important things that's happened recently has been the number of people on let's say social media, actually autistic voices being seen and being listened to, and that feeds it into the real world, if I may, outside of social media. That has at least allowed conversations to start happening. And look, I'm trying not to blow my own ego in this one, but I'm hired as an autistic advocate by a national organization, and being autistic. Autism Canada has been criticized before for not having enough actually autistic voices. Autism Canada knows that's a problem, and we are, as an organization, now bringing in more actually autistic voices. And it's like, okay, I'm the first step in that ladder. That's still, I'm so happy to be able to represent an organization that's allowing my voice to be heard, as well as listening to all the other voices. So it's having actually autistic people, their voices being heard. Again, Autism Canada, we need to have more autistic voices on staff, but that's coming.
These speakers attest to the reality that the autistic population in Canada is largely left behind, whether in terms of funding and access to services for individuals and their families, or even in terms of relatively simple accommodations of everyday life, as Bruce detailed. Bruce's own experience is also uniquely valuable, as it speaks of even fewer services for autistic adults, considered invisible or undeserving of services. Having fought for change within the government of her own province in British Columbia, Deborah Pugh aptly demonstrates the frustrations of parents of autistic children who realize that there is nothing out there for their children. She discusses the prejudices against autistic individuals within the Canadian medical system. They face dauntingly lengthy waiting lists compared to people with physical or more visible disabilities. Finally, Estee and Adam's pursuit to opt out of the system and build something new, creative, and collaborative also underscores the failure of our country's system and shines a light on how therapies currently offered aim to not really accommodate, but assimilate autistic people and erase or punish their behaviors. Estee and Adam rethink neurodiversity in the world of segregated disabilities. Despite his being nonverbal, Adam's accomplishment in his work and his educational contributions to art and neurodiversity speak volumes about the need to understand autistic people on a one-to-one basis. As a society, only growth can come from being more open-minded to the wealth that differences and neurodiversity can usher. Canada cannot boast a universal health care, all the while largely leaving behind conditions and individuals that are easiest to ignore.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.